It wasn't the coffee that broke me, and that's the part most people don't understand, because hot liquid on old skin heals faster than the moment you realize you've become invisible in the very house you built with your life. And that Sunday morning began like every other quiet morning I still bothered to wake up early for, the kind where the sun slid through the blinds as if it still believed it belonged there. The smell of toast hanging in the air like a memory that hadn't yet been told, it was no longer welcome. And I moved slowly through the kitchen not because I wanted to be careful, but because at 72, every step carries a reminder of what you've survived: the hip surgery, the stiffness, the way pain becomes routine, like breathing. Unnoticed until it's taken away, and I set the table the way I always had: plates aligned, cups placed gently, not because anyone asked me to, but because habits don't die when love does, and when my daughter came down first. Robe half-tied, eyes already glued to her phone, she didn't look up when I said good morning, not out of cruelty, I told myself, but out of exhaustion, because that's the excuse I'd been using for months, and the children followed. Sweet faces still untouched by the language of erasure, smiling at me like I still mattered, and for a moment I let myself believe maybe this day would be different, maybe the tension would stay buried. Maybe silence would protect me just one more time. But then he came in, my son-in-law, filling the doorway like the house owed him space, shoulders squared, jaw tight, not angry yet, just loaded. The way storms feel before they break, and he poured himself coffee without a word, took food without asking, sat at the head of the table like ownership was a given, while I stayed in my corner, toast and a little egg on my plate. Because taking less had become my way of proving I deserved to exist, and when I greeted him softly, he didn't answer, just chewed, loud, deliberate, every bite a reminder that silence isn't neutral. It's a weapon when only one person is allowed to use it, and the room tightened, you could feel it. The children whispering, my daughter pretending not to notice, me reaching for my tea with hands that had learned to shake quietly. And then the chair scraped back, sudden, violent, a sound that snaps you awake. And when he spoke, it wasn't loud at first, it didn't need to be, because contempt carries its own volume, and he said he was sick of this, of me. Of the way I sat there, eating, existing, and the words came sharp and familiar, the sentence so many elders hear right before they disappear: you eat but don't help, and it hit harder than any slap because it wasn't new. It was just finally said out loud, and when I tried to explain, when I mentioned my hip, the doctor, the pain, he laughed, not the kind of laugh that comes from humor, but the kind that strips you of credibility. The kind that tells everyone else in the room that your suffering doesn't qualify, and my daughter whispered for him to stop, not because it was wrong, but because it was inconvenient, and then the mug left his hand. And time slowed the way it does when something irreversible is in the air. The coffee arcing toward me, brown and steaming, landing in my lap, soaking the thin fabric, searing skin that had already known enough, and I gasped. Not from pain, but from shock, from the way humiliation bypasses nerves and goes straight to the soul. And the children stared, frozen, learning something without being taught, and the plate came down next, slammed so hard it cracked. Eggs jumping like even they wanted to escape, and he shouted about work, about hours, about money, about how everyone took and no one gave. And I realized in that moment that in his story I wasn't a person, I was a bill. A line item, something to be justified or eliminated. And when he said I wasn't entitled to live there, that I wasn't family, the words didn't echo because they were loud. They echoed because no one corrected them, not my daughter. Not the walls, not the house that had once known my laughter, and I looked at her then, searching for something, a sentence, a memory, a spine, but all she gave me was a plea to wait, to not make it worse. And I understood something chilling right there, that waiting had been my role for a long time, waiting to be defended, waiting to be valued, waiting to stop being in the way, and the silence afterward was louder than the shouting. The kind of silence that rearranges your understanding of home. And when my granddaughter handed me a napkin with hands too small for such responsibility, something inside me folded, and I said I'd go upstairs, voice barely there. And no one stopped me, not because they didn't hear, but because stopping me would have required acknowledging that I mattered. And as I climbed the stairs slowly, gripping the banister like it was the last thing still willing to hold me, I felt it then, not the burn, not the ache, but the truth settling heavy in my chest, the realization that I didn't belong there anymore, that the place I had poured my life into had quietly decided it no longer needed me. And when I reached the top and looked back, he was already on his phone, my daughter was clearing plates, the children staring down, and I knew, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that I had become a ghost in a house I once kept alive. and that if I stayed silent much longer, I wouldn't just disappear from their sight, I would disappear from myself. And as I closed the bedroom door behind me, locking it not out of fear but out of necessity, I sat on the edge of the bed. Coffee soaking into skin, shame burning deeper than heat, and I touched something beneath my clothes, something small and solid that had been with me through every change, every compromise, every quiet surrender. And in that moment, I remembered a promise made years ago, a warning spoken by someone who knew this day might come, and I realized that while they thought I had no options left, there was still one thing in this house they had never taken from me, something they assumed was already theirs, something that could change everything, but only if I was finally willing to stop being quiet. That morning didn't end with shouting or apologies. It ended with me remembering a promise, a document, and a signature that was never written, and what I decided to do next would make them wish they'd never told me I took up space. They didn't push me out all at once, and that's what makes it harder to explain to people who ask why I didn't leave sooner, because erasure doesn't arrive with suitcases or shouting, it arrives quietly, politely. One small adjustment at a time, the way you stop setting a place for yourself at the table because no one notices if you're late, the way your voice starts to feel heavier in the room than your body ever did. And after that morning with the coffee, nothing dramatic happened at first, which somehow hurt more, because life continued as if something sacred hadn't been broken, as if humiliation were just another spill to wipe up and forget. And I stayed upstairs longer than usual that day, not out of defiance but out of instinct, the same instinct that tells animals to hide when they're wounded, and when I finally came down. The house had already reorganized itself without me. Dishes washed, chairs pushed in, conversation resumed, and no one asked how my leg was. No one mentioned the stain still blooming beneath my clothes. No one acknowledged the line that had been crossed, and that's when I began to understand that what happened wasn't an accident, it was a correction, a reminder of where they believed my place truly was, and over the weeks that followed. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Meals happened whether I was there or not. Plans were made without checking if I could manage the stairs, the errands, the noise, and when I spoke, conversations didn't stop. They simply flowed around me like water around a stone, not hostile, not loud, just indifferent. And that indifference was more exhausting than anger ever could be, because you can argue with anger. But you can't reason with being unnecessary, and I told myself stories to survive it, that my daughter was tired, that her husband was stressed, that the children were growing and didn't notice things the way adults should. That families go through seasons, and this was just a cold one, but every day brought a new small lesson in how little space I was allowed to occupy. My cardigan moved from the chair because it looked messy. My pills tucked into a drawer because they cluttered the counter. My shows turned off mid-sentence because someone else wanted noise, and each time I swallowed my response because silence had become my way of staying. And staying felt safer than admitting I had nowhere else to go. And yet the house kept teaching me the same message in quieter ways, that my presence was tolerated, not welcomed, measured, not cherished. And the children noticed more than anyone realized. My grandson whispering good night like it was a secret, my granddaughter watching adults closely, learning what respect looks like when it's withheld. And I worried about what lesson they were absorbing, not about me, but about love, about power, about who gets to speak and who is expected to endure. And some nights I lay awake listening to the house breathe. The creaks and shifts of wood that once comforted me, now sounding like the slow rearranging of something that no longer needed me at its center. And I began to remember other moments I had brushed aside. The time my son-in-law joked that I should charge rent for the air I breathed, the way my daughter flinched when he raised his voice, not at me but near me, the way laughter stopped when I entered a room and resumed when I left. And I realized that the coffee wasn't the beginning, it was the punctuation mark at the end of a long sentence I'd been too patient to finish reading, and once you see that, you can't unsee it. You start noticing how your name stops being used, how requests are framed like favors, how gratitude disappears the moment it's no longer convenient, and I began shrinking myself further, eating less, speaking softer. Moving slower because somewhere deep down I believed that if I became small enough, quiet enough, grateful enough, the tension would ease. But it didn't, because shrinking doesn't create peace. It just creates room for someone else to stand taller. And my son-in-law filled that room easily, boots tossed in the hallway like the floor owed him respect, television volume rising when he entered, jokes made at my expense that everyone pretended were harmless, and my daughter laughed sometimes. Not because she found them funny, but because laughter was easier than confrontation. And I didn't blame her at first. I blamed myself for staying, for aging, for needing help after surgery, for believing that love I gave decades ago still earned me grace in the present. And there's a special kind of shame that comes with realizing your usefulness has an expiration date, because no one announces it, they just stop renewing it. And one night, standing in the kitchen rinsing my own plate because no one else did anymore, my daughter came up behind me and asked me not to take things personally, said her husband didn't mean it, said he was under pressure. And I remember thinking how strange it was that my pain had become a personal failing, something I was expected to manage privately so it wouldn't inconvenience the household, and that's when I stopped trying to explain myself. Because explanation assumes someone is listening, and I began observing instead, quietly, carefully, the way you do when you sense something is about to change, and I noticed how casually they spoke about renovations, about future plans, about our place. And it struck me then, with a mix of sadness and clarity, that they believed the past was settled. That whatever paper or promise once existed had already done its work, that I was simply waiting out the end of my usefulness. And it was in that realization that something shifted inside me, not anger, not vengeance, but awareness. The kind that makes your spine straighten even when your body is tired, because once you understand how someone sees you, you can finally decide whether you're willing to accept it, and I wasn't, not anymore. Because I began to see that the house hadn't erased me, the people inside it had, and if I didn't do something, if I didn't stop pretending this was temporary, I would wake up one day and realize I had quietly signed away more than my comfort. I had signed away my identity, and that thought frightened me more than leaving ever could, because leaving would hurt once. But staying like this would hurt every day, and late one night, as the house slept and the silence felt thick enough to hold secrets, I sat on my bed and reached for something I hadn't touched in a long time, not out of nostalgia, but out of need, something my husband had insisted on years ago, something he'd said mattered more than comfort, more than peace, more even than family harmony. And as my fingers closed around it, I understood that invisibility had a limit. And I had just reached mine. I didn't become invisible overnight, but that night, holding what my husband had left behind, I realized they had made one dangerous mistake. They assumed everything was already signed away. My husband warned me about this moment long before I was brave enough to believe it would ever come. And that truth settled over me slowly that night as I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the one thing in that house that still felt anchored to who I used to be, because some promises don't sound important when they're spoken in peace. They only reveal their weight when everything else starts to fall apart. And as I turned the small object over in my hands, memories rose uninvited, not soft ones, but clear ones, sharp with intention. The kind you don't misinterpret once you're finally ready to listen. And I remembered the day he said it, not dramatically, not with fear, but with the quiet certainty of a man who understood that love doesn't cancel human nature. It just delays it, and back then I'd laughed gently, told him he was worrying too much, told him our daughter would always take care of me, that family wouldn't forget what we built together. And he'd looked at me for a long moment before shaking his head and saying that love doesn't disappear all at once. It fades when comfort turns into entitlement, and standing there years later, feeling like a guest in my own life. I finally understood what he meant because he'd seen something I refused to see. That time changes people, and gratitude isn't inherited just because blood is shared, and the house came rushing back to me then, not as it was now, but as it had been when it was nothing more than land and intention, when his hands were strong and sunburned, and he came home every evening smelling of sawdust and sweat, determined to build something solid enough to outlast both of us. And I remembered how he chose every board, every nail, how he insisted on doing things properly even when it took longer, because he believed that care left fingerprints you couldn't scrub away later. And he used to say the house wasn't just walls, it was protection, it was proof that effort mattered. And when we finally moved in, we danced in the living room before the floors were finished, laughed at how empty it felt, talked about grandchildren running through hallways that didn't yet echo. And in those days, the idea that I could ever feel unwanted there would have sounded ridiculous, almost insulting. But life doesn't ask permission before rewriting its rules. And when he got sick, the house changed again, becoming quieter, heavier, filled with medical smells and whispered conversations. And during one of those quiet afternoons, when the light came through the window just right and the world felt paused, He asked me to sit with him, took my hand, and spoke about paperwork, about ownership, about signatures. And I remember feeling uncomfortable, like he was already gone and I wasn't ready to admit it. And he told me very plainly that the house would one day go to our daughter, but only if I decided it should, only if I believed it was still being honored the way it was meant to be. And when I asked him why he was being so careful, he said because kindness fades faster than law, and because people are gentle when they want something but impatient once they think they already have it. And I remember brushing it off, telling him our family wasn't like that. That love wouldn't turn conditional, and he squeezed my hand tighter than usual and made me promise something that felt unnecessary at the time, that I wouldn't sign anything out of guilt, that I wouldn't hand over what protected me just to keep the peace, and that if I ever felt small in the house we built together, I should remember that I wasn't the guest, I was the foundation. And as those words replayed in my mind that night, they no longer sounded dramatic, they sounded precise, like instructions meant to be followed when emotions made thinking difficult. And I realized then how many times I had almost broken that promise without noticing. How often I'd considered signing papers just to make things smoother, how close I'd come to trading my security for approval that never lasted, and it frightened me how easily that could have happened because no one was forcing me. No one was threatening, they were just assuming. An assumption can be more dangerous than pressure because it makes resistance feel rude. And sitting there in the quiet, I finally acknowledged something I hadn't wanted to admit. That my daughter and her husband believed the house already belonged to them, not because they were malicious, but because comfort had convinced them it was inevitable, and inevitability makes people careless, and once something feels inevitable, respect becomes optional, and that's when I understood that the promise wasn't about mistrust. It was about foresight, about protecting yourself before you needed protection. And I stood up slowly and crossed the room to the old desk that still sat where he'd left it, drawers stiff with age, the wood worn smooth by decades of use. And I opened the bottom drawer and found exactly what I knew would be there. Untouched, quiet, waiting, the papers that had never been signed, the line that still bore no ink. And when I held them, I didn't feel powerful, not yet. I felt steady, because power that comes from anger is reckless. But power that comes from clarity is patient. And as I sat back down and read through them again, every word suddenly made sense in a way it never had before. The conditions, the clauses, the protection built into plain language. And I realized that nothing had been taken from me yet, not legally, not truly, that everything they believed was already settled was still unresolved, and that knowledge was both comforting and terrifying. Because it meant responsibility now rested entirely on me, and responsibility is heavy when you've spent months being told you're the burden. And yet, beneath that fear, something else stirred, not revenge, not rage, but resolve. Because I finally saw the situation clearly, saw how silence had been mistaken for surrender, how patience had been mistaken for permission, and I knew that whatever I did next would change everything, not just for them, but for me. Because choosing yourself after years of shrinking feels almost like betrayal, and as I folded the papers carefully and placed them back where they belonged, I understood that I was standing at the edge of a decision that couldn't be undone. One that would either restore my dignity or confirm everything they believed about my worth. And as the house slept and the walls held their breath, I whispered the promise back into the quiet, not as a memory, but as a vow renewed. And for the first time since that morning, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like someone who was finally awake. By the time the sun rose, I wasn't grieving anymore. I was planning, and the next thing I did would make them realize just how wrong they'd been about what I still owned. Revenge doesn't always announce itself, and the most dangerous plans are the ones that look like acceptance from the outside, because after that night, I didn't change the way I spoke or moved or smiled. Not because I had forgiven anything, but because I had learned something far more useful than anger, which is that people lower their guard when they think they've already won, and the house settled back into its routine quickly. The way places do when they believe a disturbance has passed, and I let the mornings return to quiet, let meals happen without comment, let conversations float past me like weather I no longer needed to react to. And to anyone watching, it probably looked like I had retreated, like the incident with the coffee had finally put me in my place, but what they couldn't see was that I was no longer shrinking, I was observing. And observation changes everything, because once you stop defending yourself, you start noticing patterns you were too busy apologizing to see, and I noticed how confident my son-in-law had become. How easily he joked about our house. how casually he spoke about upgrades, repairs, plans that assumed permanence, and I noticed how my daughter echoed him, not enthusiastically, but automatically. The way people do when they're trying to survive someone else's certainty. And I noticed how no one asked me anything anymore, not about my plans, my needs, my thoughts, and that silence was mistaken for agreement. Which suited me perfectly because agreement invites discussion, but silence invites assumptions, and assumptions are where people make their biggest mistakes, and while they assumed, I prepared quietly, carefully. The way you do when you finally understand the stakes, and every day I stayed calm, every meal I ate without comment, every time I nodded instead of explaining, their sense of security grew, and security breeds carelessness. And carelessness leaves doors open, and I began writing things down at night, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity, dates, phrases, moments that had once blurred together when I was still trying to excuse them. And the act of writing grounded me, reminded me that what I was experiencing was real, not imagined, not exaggerated, and that mattered more than I'd realized because gaslighting doesn't always come in the form of lies. Sometimes it comes in the form of being told you're too sensitive, too tired, too old to remember correctly, and I refused to let that happen to me anymore. So I documented everything, not to confront anyone, but to anchor myself in truth. And during the day, I listened. I listened to the way my son in law spoke to others on the phone, louder, freer, less careful than he ever was around me. And I listened to how he described the house, the land, the responsibilities, always in terms of what he carried, never in terms of what he had inherited, and that distinction mattered, because people who believe they earned something feel entitled to reshape it. And people who believe something was given to them feel entitled to consume it. And he believed both, which made him dangerous, and one evening, passing by the garage, I heard his voice through the cracked door, casual, amused. The tone people use when they believe they're among allies, and he joked about me, not cruelly, not violently, but dismissively. The way you talk about an inconvenience you expect to resolve itself, and the laughter on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know, not about him, but about how safe he felt speaking that way under my roof. And I walked away without making a sound, not because I was afraid, but because fear would have rushed me, and rushing would have cost me leverage. And that night, instead of writing, I sat in the dark and let the truth settle. That nothing I said would change how he saw me, and nothing I endured would restore respect that had already been withdrawn, and that realization was strangely freeing, because once you stop trying to change someone, you can start changing your position instead, and I began thinking in terms of time, not emotion, asking myself not what I wanted them to feel, but what I needed to secure, and the answer was simple and heavy at the same time. I needed control not over them, but over myself, over my future, over the thing they believed was already settled, and every day that passed without incident reinforced their confidence. My son in law grew louder, more relaxed, more careless, and my daughter grew quieter, more withdrawn, as if she sensed something shifting but couldn't name it. And I wondered if she ever thought about the promise her father had made me swear to keep. Or if time had softened those memories the way it softens everything else, turning certainty into assumption. And sometimes I felt a flicker of guilt, not because I was wrong, but because preparation feels deceptive when you've been raised to value honesty above all else. And yet, honesty without safety is just self exposure, and I had exposed myself enough, and as the days passed, I felt something return to me slowly, not joy, not hope, but steadiness, the kind that lets you sleep through noise, the kind that doesn't flinch when voices rise downstairs, because you're no longer bracing for approval. And that steadiness became my shield, and behind it my plan took shape, not in details yet, but in direction. And direction is everything when you've been standing still for too long. And one afternoon, while the house buzzed with its usual noise, I realized something almost laughable, that they had stopped watching me entirely, not because they trusted me, but because they had written me off, and being written off is painful. But it's also powerful because people don't guard against what they no longer consider a factor. And that's when I knew the silence was working, that every swallowed word had bought me time, and time was exactly what I needed. Because time allows truth to surface without forcing it. And as I sat alone that evening, listening to laughter drift from another room, I didn't feel excluded. I felt detached, like someone watching a play whose ending they already knew. And for the first time since moving into that corner of the house, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to happen to me. I felt like I was waiting to act, and the difference between those two states is everything. Because one is helplessness and the other is choice, and when I finally went upstairs and closed my door, I reached again for the papers, not to read them, but to feel their weight, to remind myself that silence had not erased me. It had sharpened me, and that the next step wouldn't be loud or dramatic, it would be precise, and it would begin with something so ordinary, so unthreatening, that no one would see it coming. They thought my silence meant surrender, but the very next thing I did, quietly and alone, would set in motion a chain of events they could never undo. He didn't know I was listening, and that single detail is what makes the difference between suspicion and certainty, because until that moment, there was still a small part of me that wondered if I was overreacting. If age had made me too sensitive, if silence had magnified things that weren't meant to wound. But when you hear the truth spoken freely, without an audience to impress or a victim to manage, doubt dissolves instantly. And that afternoon unfolded like any other ordinary day, which is how most life-altering moments arrive, wrapped in routine, unannounced, almost polite, and I was walking down the hallway when I heard his voice from the garage. Casual and unguarded, the tone people use when they believe no consequences exist, and I stopped without meaning to, not because I wanted to eavesdrop, but because my name floated through the air the way smoke does. Slow and unmistakable, and he was laughing, telling someone how it felt like living with a ghost, how I drifted through the house, ate the food, said thank you like royalty, and never lifted a finger. And when he said he'd rather clean a dog kennel than share space with a mother-in-law who thought she was owed something, the words didn't stab the way insults usually do. They settled, heavy and final, because they weren't meant to hurt me. They were meant to entertain someone else, and that's how I knew they were true, and I stood there longer than I should have, listening not just to what he said, but to how easily he said it, the comfort in his voice. The certainty that no one in that house would ever challenge him, and I felt something strange happen inside me, not anger, not tears, but a quiet slowing, like a clock resetting itself. Because heartbreak feels different when it confirms what you already know, and I walked back to my room without making a sound, closed the door gently, and sat on the bed staring at the wall, replaying the sentence again and again. Not to torture myself, but to memorize it, because clarity deserves to be remembered accurately. And I thought about how many times I'd defended him in my own head, how often I'd softened his words, how frequently I'd blamed stress or fatigue or misunderstandings, and how unnecessary all of that was now, because you can't misinterpret contempt when it's spoken as a joke, and that night I didn't write anything down. Not because I didn't need to, but because writing implies reflection, and reflection implies uncertainty, and there was none left, and instead I lay awake listening to the house settle, thinking about something my husband once told me. That the most dangerous lies are the ones whispered, not shouted, because whispers assume no one cares enough to listen, and my son-in-law had whispered his truth into the world, confident it would never reach me, and he was wrong. And that wrongness changed everything, because it stripped away the last excuse I'd been using to stay still. And by morning, something fundamental had shifted, not in the house, but in me, because I woke up with a strange calmness. The kind that follows a decision you didn't know you were waiting to make, and I moved through the day differently, slower, steadier, not because I was unsure, but because I was certain, and certainty doesn't rush. And I watched them all interact from a distance, my daughter managing the children, my son-in-law filling the space with noise and confidence, and I saw them as they were, not as I wished them to be. And it occurred to me then how dangerous assumptions can be, because they assumed I was harmless, that I had no options, that my world had narrowed to that bedroom and that kitchen and their tolerance. And I realized that assumption was the only thing standing between them and consequence, and later that morning, while the house was busy with its usual noise, I slipped on my coat and picked up my bag, and no one asked where I was going. Not because they didn't care, but because they no longer thought it mattered, and I walked to the bus stop at the end of the street, the air crisp, the neighborhood unchanged, the world moving forward whether I participated or not. And as the bus pulled up and I took a seat by the window, I felt a mix of sadness and relief, because sadness comes from realizing something is over, but relief comes from knowing you no longer have to pretend it isn't. And as the town passed by outside the glass, I held my bag close, not because of what was inside it physically, but because of what it represented, the final shift from endurance to action. And when I stepped off the bus and walked toward the small office I hadn't visited in years, the one my husband had trusted enough to plan for this very possibility, my heart beat steadily, not with fear, but with purpose. Because fear asks what might go wrong, and purpose asks what must be done. And when I pushed open the door and smelled familiar paper and old wood, I knew without hesitation that I was exactly where I needed to be. Because the sentence I'd overheard hadn't just hurt me, it had freed me from hesitation. And once hesitation is gone, everything else becomes logistics. That conversation in the garage didn't make me cry. It sent me downtown, straight to the one person who could confirm what I already suspected, that the house was never really theirs. One signature is all that separates ownership from assumption. And I learned that truth the moment I sat down across from the man who had known my husband long enough to recognize the look on my face without needing an explanation. Because some stories don't need rehearsing when the ending has been quietly waiting for years. And as I placed the folder on the desk between us, the same folder I had almost convinced myself was just sentimental paperwork. Not leverage, he adjusted his glasses and nodded slowly, not surprised, not confused, just confirming what he already knew. And when he told me gently that nothing had changed legally, that the house and the land were still entirely under my authority, that no transfer had ever occurred, the words didn't explode inside me the way victory usually does. They settled heavy and grounding, because relief doesn't always feel loud. Sometimes it feels like finally exhaling after holding your breath for months without realizing it. And I asked questions carefully, not because I doubted him, but because certainty deserves to be examined from every angle. And he explained the structure my husband had put in place, the safeguards, the requirement of my consent, the clause that made my signature the final gatekeeper. And with every sentence, the picture became clearer, not just legally, but emotionally, because what my husband had done wasn't about control, it was about protection, about making sure that love couldn't be weaponized against me. And as I listened, I thought about how confidently my son in law spoke about his house, how easily my daughter assumed permanence, and I felt a strange sadness for them, not because they were losing something, but because they had built their sense of entitlement on something that had never been guaranteed, and entitlement makes people careless, and carelessness always costs more than caution. And when I asked what my options were, the answer was simple and devastating in its clarity, that I could keep the house, sell it, lease it, gift it, or do nothing at all, that every outcome rested with me. And I realized then how deeply I had underestimated my own position. Not because I lacked power, but because I had been trained not to use it. And we talked quietly about timelines, about discretion, about how to proceed without causing unnecessary noise. And I told him noise was the last thing I wanted. Not because I feared confrontation, but because confrontation gives people time to manipulate, and manipulation thrives on delay. And when I stood up to leave, he asked me gently if I was all right. And I answered honestly for the first time in months, telling him that I was clearer than I had been in a long while. And outside, the town looked exactly the same as it always had, the bakery still smelling like cinnamon, the courthouse still worn and unremarkable, the world unchanged despite the fact that mine had just shifted on its axis. And as I walked slowly through the streets, I thought about the land itself. The acres behind the house that my husband had loved as much as the walls he built, the trees, the open space, the quiet that had once made the place feel like refuge instead of territory. And that's when I noticed the flyer, pinned among guitar lessons and lost pets, asking landowners to consider preserving rural properties. And the idea arrived fully formed, not as a reaction, but as a solution, because selling the house alone would have been practical. But this offered something more final, something that aligned with the promise I had made. And I stood there longer than I meant to, reading the words again and again, thinking about what it would mean to protect the land from ever becoming a bargaining chip, to ensure that no one who disrespected it could ever claim it. And when I folded the flyer into my coat pocket, I felt something close to peace. Because peace doesn't come from winning arguments, it comes from removing yourself from battles that never honored you to begin with. And when I returned to the house later that afternoon, no one asked where I had been. No one noticed the difference in my posture, the steadiness in my movements, and that anonymity suited me, because anonymity gave me room to act without interference. And that night, as the television murmured downstairs and laughter floated up the stairs like background noise from another life, I sat on my bed and spread the papers out again, this time with intention, not doubt, and I reviewed them carefully. Not because I feared making a mistake, but because I respected the weight of the decision ahead, and I packed a small bag quietly, not everything, just what mattered, the things that couldn't be replaced by money or memory. And I understood then that leaving wouldn't make me homeless. It would make me free, because home isn't where you're tolerated, it's where you're protected. And as I folded my clothes, I realized how little I truly needed to begin again. and how much of what I'd been holding onto had been fear, not attachment. And when I lay down that night, I slept deeply for the first time since the coffee, not because the problem was solved, but because the path forward was finally visible. And the next morning, while the house moved through its usual rhythm, I made a phone call that would quietly set everything in motion. A call no one would hear, no one would suspect, a call that would turn assumption into shock. And by the time I hung up, I knew there was no turning back, because once truth is acted upon, it stops being a secret and starts becoming history. They thought I'd gone downtown to calm myself, but the call I made that morning would ensure the house and land could never belong to them again. I didn't sell the house to punish anyone, and that distinction mattered to me more than I expected, because revenge burns hot and fast, but clarity moves slowly and lasts. And everything I did from that moment forward was guided by one simple truth I could no longer ignore, that peace and proximity were no longer compatible in that place. And once I accepted that, the decision stopped feeling heavy and started feeling necessary, and the days that followed were quiet on the surface, ordinary even, which is how irreversible choices usually unfold. Beneath routines and small talk and the comforting illusion that nothing has changed, and while the house buzzed with its usual noise, I moved through it like a visitor preparing to leave a hotel, respectful, detached, no longer trying to make the space feel like mine. And I watched how comfortable they were, how relaxed my son-in-law had become, joking loudly, making plans aloud, talking about the future as if it had already been handed to him. And that confidence confirmed I was doing the right thing, because people who believe they are entitled rarely protect what they claim. And when the representatives from the land trust came to view the property, I met them quietly at the back gate, dressed plainly, speaking softly, presenting myself not as the owner but as someone with authority, because authority doesn't require performance, and we walked the boundaries together, the trees standing tall, the creek still running clean, the land unchanged by the drama inside the house. And as they asked questions, I answered easily, because this place had been part of my life longer than any conflict, and when they expressed interest, genuine interest, not opportunistic, I felt a surprising sense of relief because I wasn't selling something precious to strangers. I was placing it into care, and that difference eased the last bit of guilt I'd been carrying. And when the offer came back, fair and clean and final, I read it slowly, not for numbers, but for intention, and when I signed, my hand didn't shake, because by then the decision had already been made in my heart, and that evening. While the house laughed and ate and carried on, I packed quietly, folding my life into a small suitcase without ceremony, choosing only what mattered, not because I was leaving in anger, but because I was leaving with purpose, and I paused once. Standing in the doorway, watching my daughter lean into her husband on the couch, both of them relaxed, secure, unaware, and I felt a pang, not of regret, but of finality, because that image confirmed what words never could. That there was no space left for me there that didn't require my silence, and I closed the door gently, zipped the bag, and waited, not for permission, but for timing, and when the morning came, still dark and quiet, I slipped out without waking anyone, the air cool and sharp, tasting like something new, and the taxi arrived exactly when I'd scheduled it, because control, I'd learned, is built from small, precise choices. And as the house receded behind me, I didn't look back, not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much to carry with me into whatever came next, and the courthouse process was simple, almost disappointingly so: stamps, signatures, confirmations, and just like that, what had been assumed for years was undone in minutes. And when I received the final confirmation, the weight lifted, not because I had won, but because I had finished something that should have been resolved long ago, and I went somewhere safe after that, somewhere warm, where no one asked questions and no one expected explanations, and I let myself rest. Because rest isn't laziness, it's recovery, and somewhere across town, life continued without me, unaware that its foundation had just shifted, and when the authorities arrived at the house the next morning, I wasn't there to witness the confusion, the disbelief, the panic, but I didn't need to be, because I already knew how people react when certainty evaporates. And later, when my phone rang again and again, names flashing that had once mattered, I didn't answer, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity, because some conversations are only meant to happen after truth has fully arrived, and I knew that when I finally did return, it would be on my terms, not theirs. And that difference would make all the noise worth enduring. I wasn't there when they learned the house was gone, but 15 minutes later, I walked back toward it, carrying the papers that would end every argument before it began. I wasn't there when the knock first sounded, and that absence was intentional, because some truths land harder when the person who delivered them isn't standing nearby to soften the impact. And I learned that lesson the hard way over many years of explaining myself to people who had already decided what they wanted to hear. So while uniformed footsteps crossed the porch and unfamiliar voices filled the entryway, I was sitting quietly elsewhere, hands wrapped around a warm cup, breathing steadily, letting the moment unfold without me rushing to manage it. And I imagined the confusion spreading across my son in law's face as certainty cracked. The way arrogance always falters when it meets paperwork, and I imagined my daughter's panic rising not because she had been betrayed, but because the ground she assumed was solid had suddenly shifted, and I knew the children would be watching. Absorbing another lesson they never asked for, that adults don't always get to keep what they misuse. And when the phone began to ring, I let it, because urgency belongs to people who waited too long, and I had waited long enough. And when I finally did return, walking up the gravel path with the documents folded neatly in my hand, the scene matched my expectations almost perfectly. Officers standing calm and professional, my son in law loud and indignant. My daughter pale and shaking, voices overlapping in a desperate attempt to reverse something that had already been finalized. And the moment my daughter saw me, she ran toward me like a child again, tears streaking her face, asking what I'd done, why I'd done it, as if the answer hadn't been spoken every day for months in smaller, quieter ways. And I looked at her then, really looked, and felt no triumph, only clarity, because clarity doesn't gloat, it explains. And I told her calmly that I had taken responsibility for my future, that I had protected what needed protecting, and that the house was never theirs to weaponize against me, and my son in law stormed forward, fists tight. Words spilling fast and furious about betrayal, about family, about rights he never actually had, and I listened until he ran out of breath, because listening costs nothing once you've already decided, and when I finally spoke. My voice didn't shake because this conversation was no longer about approval, it was about boundaries, and I reminded him of the morning coffee burned my skin, of the words he thought were harmless, of the laughter he shared at my expense. And I told him plainly that no one who treats another human being that way gets to call their home permanent, and the silence that followed was heavy, not awkward, but instructive. The kind that forces everyone present to reassess their assumptions, and the officers handed over the notice, professional, final, explaining timelines and next steps. And my daughter clutched the papers like they might dissolve if she held them tightly enough. And for a moment, I saw her the way she used to be, young, uncertain, searching for stability, and I almost reached for her. Almost apologized out of habit, but habits are what got me erased in the first place. And instead, I told her that I loved her, that love hadn't been the issue, but respect had been. And that love without respect turns into control whether anyone intends it or not. And I watched understanding flicker briefly across her face before being swallowed by fear. And that told me everything I needed to know about where she was in her journey. And when I turned to leave, the wind brushed my back lightly, the kind of gentle pressure that feels like permission. And I walked away without shouting, without threats, without satisfaction, because dignity doesn't need witnesses to be real. And later that evening, when the noise settled and the reality sank in, messages arrived, some angry, some pleading. Some confused, all too late, and I didn't respond immediately, because endings deserve silence, not commentary, and as night fell, I sat quietly and reflected not on what I had taken, but on what I had returned to myself. Autonomy, safety, the right to decide where and how I would live, and I realized that the knock on that door hadn't removed them from the house. It had removed the illusion that power had ever belonged anywhere but with the person willing to stand alone. And the next morning, I prepared for one final thing, not a confrontation, not an argument, but a closing. Something brief and necessary, because some chapters don't end until you read the last line out loud. I thought the knock on the door would be the end, but there was one last thing I needed to say, and when I said it, the truth finally settled for all of us. I never planned to say goodbye, not the way people expect endings to happen, because real endings don't come with speeches or slammed doors. They come quietly when you finally stop asking for permission to exist, and that morning. As I stood across the street watching the house breathe in the early light, I felt no anger, no regret, only a calm certainty that surprised even me, because certainty feels different from relief. It doesn't rush in like air after drowning. It settles like weight finally placed where it belongs, and when I walked back up the path one last time, the house didn't feel like mine anymore, not because it had been taken from me, but because I had already carried its meaning somewhere safer. And inside, the rooms echoed with chaos, boxes half filled, voices strained, the sound of people scrambling when they realized the ground they stood on was never theirs. And my daughter saw me first, standing there unsure, smaller than I remembered, and for a moment I saw all the years stacked inside her, the girl I raised, the woman she became, the choices she made trying to survive someone else's shadow. And she asked me why, not angrily, not accusingly, just broken. And I told her the truth without cruelty, that I stayed quiet because I loved her, that I left because I loved myself. And that love should never require erasing one to preserve the other. And when my son in law interrupted, demanding explanations, calling it betrayal, I didn't argue. Because arguments are for people who believe the outcome is still undecided. And I told him calmly that throwing coffee wasn't what ended things, that words spoken in confidence mattered more than apologies spoken too late. And that dignity, once stripped away repeatedly, doesn't grow back in the same soil. And the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy with understanding. And for the first time, no one spoke over me, no one minimized my voice. Because there was nothing left to negotiate, and as I handed over the final papers and turned to leave, I said the sentence that had been forming in me for weeks, the one truth I needed to release, that I hadn't taken up space. I had been the space, the one that held everything together while everyone else grew comfortable forgetting it. And those words didn't land like an insult, they landed like a fact, and facts don't require forgiveness. And when I stepped away for the last time, the weight I'd carried for years lifted, not dramatically, but permanently, and the life that followed didn't look grand from the outside. No big house, no recognition, just quiet mornings. Tea on a porch, birds that didn't ask anything of me, and days that belonged entirely to my choosing. And with the money from the land, I didn't disappear, I redirected it, helping others like me who had been told they were burdens, who had been pushed into corners of lives they built themselves. And listening to their stories reminded me that invisibility is never a personal failure. It's a system built on convenience, and I spoke when invited, not loudly. But honestly, telling people that silence is not patience when it costs your safety, that forgiveness is not permission to return to harm, and that age does not erase ownership of your voice. And one day, a letter came from my daughter, apologizing, explaining, saying she finally understood, and I read it slowly, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer without responding, not because I was bitter, but because healing doesn't always require reopening doors that taught you how to leave. And at night, when I sit alone with my husband's photograph nearby, I tell him I kept my promise, that I didn't sign away my worth to keep peace. And I sleep easily knowing that the house we built didn't disappear. It transformed into something protected, something lasting, something that could never be used to harm again. And if you're listening to this wondering when your own moment will come, wondering how long you're supposed to endure before choosing yourself, I want you to know this. Dignity is not something you earn by suffering quietly. It's something you protect by standing when it's time. And it's never too late to remember that you are not taking up space. You are the reason it exists at all.